So this is the presentation I'm going to give you. In the right-hand side, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you might not be able to, you might see a lot of faces. You can toggle the various options at the top there to remove that or otherwise, and you can see other people in the meeting as well. So let me just remove that. Okay, so the meeting's now locked. You're all in, you can leave at any time, but I'm afraid you won't be able to rejoin. So I'm going to go through the Great Trees of London map, which was published recently by Blue Crow Media. This is an image of the map. It is also something which I have a copy here, so you may be able to see that. I've got this virtual background, which I'll talk about a bit later as well. But the map consists of 46 of what I consider to be London's greatest trees. And we chose these by going through, looking at, we had a long list of about 120 trees initially. Great Trees of London. 46 of London's greatest trees, from Tottenham to Brixton and from Richmond to Greenwich. First of all, I'll talk about the old guard. So these are the trees which in London are the very old trees. And the first one to start with, I think, will be the Totteridge Yew. So the Totteridge Yew is in an old churchyard in Barnet. It's 1,000 to 2,000 years old, and the trees are, this is a yew tree. So yew trees traditionally can live for a very, very long time. Not traditionally, in reality, they can live for a very long time. But there's a great sort of unknown about yew trees when they get very old. Because trees become very hollow, it's very difficult to tell how old a tree is, except through records and so on. So it's thought that this tree is between 1,000 and 2,000 years old. If it's 2,000 years old, it's been here since the Romans arrived. If it's 1,000 years old, it's only as old as William the Conqueror. Either way, it's very old, London's oldest tree. It's rather small and looks a little bit odd when you go to see it, but when you get very close to it, you can see how ancient it is. It's a very fascinating tree and worth a visit to Totteridge on the Northern Line. If you want to see exactly where it is, you have to buy this map, which will show you exactly where it is. Right, next page. There are other old trees in London as well, certainly in places like Richmond Park, Greenwich Park, and one or two trees, many dozens of trees actually, all over town, which are dotted around in parks, former private gardens, and many of them are public. This is the Bruce Castle Oak, which is in Tottenham. Bruce Castle is a park in Tottenham, has an old house. The museum, the local history museum for Tottenham is there, which used to be the house of Rowland Hill, who invented the postal service. That's a fun fact to put in there, but this is interestingly a sessile oak. Most oak trees in London are pedunculate oak, which is Quercus robur, the English oak. The sessile oak is very similar, has slightly different leaves. The pedunculate oak has, now I might get this the wrong way around, one has leaves on stalks and acorns not on stalks, and the other one is the other way around, but I just can't remember for the life of me what that is at the moment. Maybe we'll follow up with an email just to confirm that. But the Bruce Castle oak is thought to be at least 500 years old. It's propped up with these amazing wooden props, which is quite sort of apt, really. This is another view of it, which is just coming on your screen now. It's a huge tree, a local landmark, which people shelter under. You can see the Bruce Castle Museum there. This was an obvious tree in my mind to put in the map. It's one of the trees which I think is a local landmark. It might not be so well known in other parts of London. So if you live in Richmond, for instance, you've probably never heard of the Bruce Castle Oak. If you live in Tottenham, you will have done. Whereas if you live in Tottenham, you're bound to have heard of some of the trees in Richmond Park. Therefore, I think this tree is well worth finding out a bit more about. So these are the sort of criteria we were thinking about when we were choosing the trees which should go on the list. And this felt like a very important one to put on there. Of course, there are some environments in London which are full of old trees. It's very difficult to pick one single tree. So the image which is just coming up on your screen now is Greenwich Park. And Greenwich Park is famous for the sweet chestnut trees there. Another tree that will last for many hundreds of years. The trees in Greenwich Park were planted in the 17th century. Samuel Pepys mentions going to Greenwich Park, which of course was a royal park. It was a royal hunting park. The sweet chestnuts which are there were planted in a manner to lay it out in a very formal way, like a French chateau garden. But we had to choose one tree. And the next tree, which is coming up on your screen, is the tree that we actually chose. So this is the great tree that we selected for Greenwich Park. It's in the flower garden, which is in the southeast corner of Greenwich Park. It's the same tree which is an official Great Tree of London. I should say something about the official great trees as well. So if anybody's seen a book or has a book, which came out in 2006, actually, the Time Out Guide to the Great Trees of London, of which I have a copy here. This is a great reference book. It's a bit difficult to see. It has 61 trees in it. Some of the trees in the map are the same trees, but quite a lot are not the same trees. So the Bruce Castle Oak, for instance, isn't in the Time Out book. The Greenwich Park Sweet Chestnut is. There's lots of plane trees, there's lots of oak trees in the Time Out book. We felt like this map needed to have a bit of an update. And as we go through this presentation, I'll show you some of the more interesting and unusual trees that we've chosen. But we're still on the old guard. Let's see what we've got up next. So as well as Greenwich Park, of course, Richmond Park is famous for its old trees. And indeed, Richmond Park has more ancient and veteran trees than some countries have in the whole of their country. So Belgium, for instance, has fewer ancient trees than can be found in Richmond Park. So we had to have a tree from Richmond Park. And this wonderful oak tree is known as the Royal Oak. It's thought to be 600 years old. Some people say it's 800 years old. Again, because it's a really ancient veteran tree, it's hollow. So you could never do a ring count on it. There's no way really of telling exactly how old it is. So this is a fascinating tree, which I think which is well worth seeing. Now, I've just seen a message from someone that's having difficulty not having pictures of the trees. What you have to do in that case is go to the top right of your screen, and you should see a little box within a box. And if you click on that, you'll be able to toggle between the pictures of the big picture of me, which you want a small picture of, and the big picture of the trees, which I'm sure is what you would rather see. So I'm going to show you another really old tree. Well, it's a tree that looks really old. So this is a tree which we chose for the map, which is down at Lesnies Abbey in Belvedere in Abbey Wood, southeast London. This is a mulberry. There's a lot of very old mulberries in London, a surprising number, a lot to choose from. In the end, we whittled it down to 3. but there could have been more quite easily. One or two didn't make the cut, which are very worthy of it, but we felt this one was a really good one because it's so picturesque. It's another tree which is propped up on your, but with tree props. It's almost recumbent. It's almost, it's considerably wider than it is tall. It's next to the ruins of Lesnies Abbey, which is a Norman church, a Norman abbey, which was destroyed during the dissolution of the monasteries in the, by Henry VIII. This tree isn't as old as that, though. This tree, apparently, according to the mulberry expert, Peter Coles, whose book, Mulberry, is well worth looking out for if you've seen that, told me that this tree he thought was only 200 years old. So mulberries have this amazing trick of looking much older than they really are. That's true with many mulberries. This one then is only 200 years old. I've got another mulberry which I'm going to show you as well, coming up on your screen now. This is a mulberry in Sayes Court Park in Deptford, which is a wonderful old tree. Sayes Court Park is a tiny little park near the river, and it's the last bit of what was John Evelyn's garden. So the famous diarist and tree lover John Evelyn, who used to live in Deptford, had a house right next to this. It's thought that his house, that it was planted with all sorts of amazing trees. It was a garden that was also one that during the 17th century, Evelyn lent out his house to Tsar Peter the Great. Peter the Great came to London to learn about shipbuilding in the Royal Dockyard, which was next door. Unfortunately, Peter the Great trashed the place he was a 25-year-old, and one night a couple of years ago, this stone appeared next to the mulberry tree, claiming that Peter the Great planted this tree in John Evelyn's garden in the 17th century. Some tests have been done on this tree, and it proves that that's untrue. So it's fake news, I'm afraid, that this tree is that old. Like the tree before, it's probably only a couple of hundred years old. But what's remarkable about it is that it's in Deptford, right in inner London, and it is what is part of Evelyn's garden. So I think it's well worth being included for those reasons. When you talk about trees in London and old trees, you have to think about plane trees. London, of course, is famous for its plane trees. Indeed, plane trees are called London planes. The London plane tree is a tree which is not native to London. In fact, it was constructed by people, and it was grown as a hybrid between two transcontinental species, the American sycamore and the Oriental plane. The oldest one in London arrived in the 17th century, and it's still going strong, and it's in Barnes. It's called Barney. It's absolutely enormous. Unfortunately, I couldn't photograph it very well, so this is all you're going to be able to see of it. It's the lower part of its trunk. Well worth going and finding that tree. There are other old plane trees in London as well, but nothing's going to be older than about 350 years old. The London plane tree, this hybrid tree, didn't exist before that date. So next, I'm going to move on to what I'm calling the urban warriors. So these trees aren't necessarily so old as the trees that we've just been through. These trees are trees which were probably planted in the city, and the city was the city at that time. So these are going to be less than 300 years old, and some of them are going to be Victorian. The Victorians, of course, planted many, many trees in London, and we have them to thank for a lot of how central London looks now, the trees that we see in the royal parks and so on. But this is going back a little bit further. This is Berkeley Square in Mayfair, and Berkeley Square in Mayfair holds probably the oldest trees in central London. Those trees were planted in 1789. They're London plane trees. The tree which I selected is the one that you can see on the right there, next to the strange contemporary sculpture of a tree, perhaps. I'm not quite sure what that is supposed to be. But Berkeley Square's trees are really remarkable. 250-year-old plane trees in the centre of London, perhaps some of the oldest trees in Westminster. The next tree coming up isn't a plane tree. So there are going to be some trees in here which are not plane trees. I was very conscious that it would be very easy to include many, many plane trees. There are probably 46 individual plane trees in London which are worthy of being included in a map. But once you've seen one or two plane trees, you've probably seen all of them. I mean, I would perhaps disagree with myself there, but I think it's worth having lots of different species. This is a species that was very popular with the Victorians. It's the Indian bean tree. If anybody knows the Indian bean tree, it has really attractive flowers, a bit like a horse chestnut, which appear in high summer around July. And it has long, sort of vanilla pod-like seeds, which are like beans, I suppose, hence its name, the Indian bean tree. Indian bean tree is not from India, it's from North America. And that name is an old colonial throwback to a name for Native Americans. It was thought that these were reminded colonialists of what a bean looked like and imagined that only the Native Americans would use them, perhaps. The Victorians were very keen on them. They're planted around Westminster, around the Houses of Parliament. They don't last particularly long, so they may last 150 to 200 years old. This one's in Embankment Gardens, and as you can see, it's already propped up with sticks. It's becoming recumbent, and it's very popular with kids who like to climb all over it. Also, some of the taller branches on it are beginning to die off as well, which is a great shame. But a tree which is worth going to see in the summer for its blossom. And also another interesting thing about Indian bean trees, Catalpa bignonioides, for anybody who likes a Latin name, the leaves are aromatic, so you can crush the leaves and get a very nice smell from them, which is a little known fact about Indian bean trees. This one, a particularly characterful example, I think. Right, the next tree is a native tree, and this is quite a famous tree. Many of you have probably heard of it already. This is the hardy tree, and it's an ash, Fraxinus excelsior, or our native ash. It's in the churchyard of St Pancras Church near King's Cross. The tree is called the hardy ash because it was planted by Thomas Hardy, the poet and novelist. So before Thomas Hardy wrote Tess of the D'Urbervilles and all his famous works, he was an architect. He trained as an architect, and in his 20s, he worked for an architecture firm in London. That firm was given the job of constructing the railway into King's Cross. As a result of the construction of the railway, they needed to decrease the size of the churchyard. And that job was given to Thomas Hardy. And what he did was he grouped all the gravestones from the graves which were moved as a result of this development into a circle and planted an ash tree in the center of them. So it's like some kind of art installation going to see this. There are dozens of these gravestones, early Victorian gravestones, around a tree that we know is at least 150 years old. It's really worth going to visit. There's some great trees in that churchyard as well. The next tree coming up is another old tree, Victorian tree. In fact, it's probably older than Victorian. This is a fig tree in Islington. It's on Amwell Street. It's next to the Clerkenwell Parochial School, which has a plaque on it saying it was built in 1827. This fig tree was probably planted at the same time. At that time, it was thought that trees could provide an awful lot of educational opportunities to kids, and fig trees are biblical. and they were taught Bible stories through the use of figs, and fig trees are often found around old churches and old schools, and they were often used in that educational capacity. This one then is nearly 200 years old. It's recumbent, it's propped up, and it's right in the centre of London again, not far from King's Cross. A surprising number of old and interesting trees in the area. Okay, so the next tree that I'm going to show you is another plane tree, a London plane. And this is what I call a baobab plane. So there are all sorts of different types of London plane. They're cultivars, if you like. They're all London planes, but they all have slightly different characteristics. The baobab plane is a very unusual type. This one's in Ravenscourt Park in Hammersmith. And the story with baobab planes is they're incredibly fat and rather short. There are a few of them dotted around London. They're associated with the Victorian gardener William Masters. This one, I think, is the most corpulent and the most characterful of these trees. It's on its own in Ravenscourt Park. There's lots of local myths associated with it, including that the Luftwaffe bombed it during the war, and that accounts for its shape, because it's surrounded by huge other trees. But again, fake news. It's not really, this is what it's supposed to look like. You can see others in places like the Imperial War Museum, and quite a lot of churchyards. Wapping Church has one as well. But the one in Ravenscourt Park, as I say, is the most interesting, or the largest of them. Of course, when you think about plane trees, mostly they're very big trees. And this is one of my favorites, which is coming up on your screen now. This is the Windrush Square plane tree in Brixton. It's outside the library, next to the Ritzy Cinema, right in the centre of Brixton. They've built the piazza around it. And so I think that's the end of that, of the urban those older ones. And next we're on to the Youthful Upstart. So we're going to go through some of the younger and more diverse trees which were selected for the map. So the next one is a palm tree. So you may not have seen this one before, or if you live or work near Westminster, this is on the north side of Westminster Bridge. It's a canary palm, a really glorious canary palm, a tree which you don't see too many of in London, but this one's thriving. It's a local landmark. It's in the middle of a roundabout next to the MI6 building and close to the Houses of Parliament, and shows actually how mild the climate can be in the centre of London. And the centre of London has what's known as the urban heat island, which means that during the night, particularly, temperatures can be much milder than during the day. That means that that trees that would otherwise not thrive in London can grow quite successfully. This tree you would find elsewhere, but some of the other ones I'm going to show you are trees which you might be much more surprised to see. The next one isn't a particularly exotic tree in terms of it being tender or any of that. This tree is more historical, and it's about 20th century history of greening, environmentalism and planting trees in London. This is a tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima. It grows in just in the near Tooley, just off Tooley Street, and this was a planted to commemorate Ada Salter, who was the great tree planter of the borough of Bermondsey. The former borough of Bermondsey is now in the borough of Southwark. No, excuse me, I think I've just got a technical issue. Somebody's saying they've got a small window. I think what you need to do is go to the top right and click on a square which has a small square within it, and that should be able to swap round your windows. You should be able to toggle which window you're seeing. So apologies if anybody's having that problem. Okay, so back to the Tree of Heaven and Ada Salter. Ada Salter was the mayor of Bermondsey in the early 20th century. Bermondsey was, of course, well, maybe you didn't know this, it was an industrial slum full of docklands, full of tanneries and other factories. 100,000 people were crammed into an area which is now populated with 50,000 people. So you can imagine how much, how people were living on top of each other. It was also extremely unplanted with anything. There were all sorts of disease was rife there. And what Ada Salter did was plant 7,000 trees within about 10 years on the streets and on the estates of Bermondsey. She built estates around there. She built model housing. And the tree that she favoured was the Tree of Heaven. The Tree of Heaven comes from China. It is a very attractive tree. It's very fast growing. The trouble with it is it's become quite invasive. So unfortunately, it can seed itself and sucker itself all over the place. And you will see in some parts of London, railway lines which are covered with Tree of Heavens. So it's a bit of a problematic tree. In other parts of the world, it's become very invasive, and it becomes very smelly as well. The smell thing doesn't seem to occur in London. Maybe that's because our climate isn't quite warm enough for it yet, but it does seed itself very readily. It goes a beautiful colour in the autumn as well. It's a tree which I rather like. It doesn't live for very long. And the tree which you can see here, which was planted over where Ada Salter's ashes were interred, has an inscription over it, and it was planted to commemorate the memory of Ada Salter. The next tree is going to be, so this one is a tree which is a local landmark. It's not a particularly rare tree. It's a almond. So, just go up one. An almond tree in Finsbury Park. So this tree has this rather amazing contorted corkscrew trunk, which gives it a lot of character. It's also one of the first trees to flower in this part of London. In some years, it will be flowering in January. Almond trees have one wonderful blossom. They're a prunus, so they're connected to the cherry tree. This is Prunus dulcis. Cherries, plums, peaches, almonds, apricots, they're all the same family of trees. They're all prunus trees. Almond is one of the early flowering ones, and of course it produces almond fruits in the autumn. Almonds used to be very popular street trees in London. Now they're very rare. This one in Finsbury Park is, is in fact a rather unusual example of one. Has really striking pink blossom as well. While we're talking about cherry trees as well, another bunch of cherry trees that made the cut for the map are the Yoshino cherries of Winterbrook Road. And you can see those behind me. I'm not standing on Winterbrook Road. I'm obviously locked down at home. This is by the magic of Zoom. My virtual background is Winterbrook Road in Herne Hill, which is lined with Yoshino cherries. Yoshino cherries are the most popular cherry tree in Japan that you would find gracing the streets of Tokyo. They're quite unusual in the UK, but in Herne Hill, one street has been planted entirely with Yoshino cherries. And they are very, very beautiful. And they're my favorite cherry tree, in fact, because they have this very striking white blossom, which appears at the end of March. And every year I try to lead a walking tour down there to go and look at them. This year it was scuppered, unfortunately, but maybe some of you can join next year. Keep an eye on the Museum of Walking's website for details about that, if you're interested. Right, so the next tree that I'm going to show you is a very unusual one, and really exposes how the climate in central London particularly is changing. This is a tree which shouldn't grow in London. This is a Norfolk Island pine. They grow in places like Nice, Los Angeles, and in much more Mediterranean type environments. But this one's growing on an estate in South London. I reckon it was a house plant that it got too big and they planted it out and it survived. It's must have been there for 30, 40 years. It's got its own little garden around it, and it's absolutely amazing to see this. When I first discovered it, I couldn't quite believe my eyes. A Norfolk Island pine is related to the monkey puzzle. It's an Araucaria heterophylla, I think is the Latin name, and otherwise known as a house plant. So here it is. London climate change really is happening, and here's the proof. We're getting to the end in the next few minutes, so if you've got any questions, I'll be able to look out for those shortly, so have a think about those. And I'm going to show you the last tree on the presentation this evening. Not the last tree on the map, but maybe the tree which I have a particular fondness for. This is a giant redwood, which is at New Cross Gate Station in southeast London. It's a tree which I felt should be on the map because it's a local landmark, but also it's in a very precarious position. It's right next to Platform 1. The plot of land that it's next to is derelict and no doubt ripe for redevelopment. It looks like the Bakerloo line may be extended down to New Cross, in which case this tree could be in danger. So I see it as part of what the work of this map is to raise awareness of trees like this, which could be precarious. And if they disappeared, maybe people would mourn the loss of it, but maybe they wouldn't know that anybody else also loved it. And I know that quite a lot of people in this area notice this tree and have it use it as a local landmark, and I kind of feel like that's worth celebrating. It's a bit like the Finsbury Park almond. I think those two trees fit into that category of local landmarks that need to be celebrated and protected. One other tree which I'll mention as well, I haven't got an image of it, but it's another mulberry, and it's in the the former London Chest Hospital in Bethnal Green. The garden there is full of trees, including one very old mulberry, which is over 200 years old. It's being redeveloped, that tree's threatened, and the developers are saying, we can move that tree, we can dig it up and plonk it somewhere else in the ground, but I don't think that's going to work. And I think a lot of people are very worried that if that gets the go-ahead, that tree might die. So again, that's a tree that I wanted to draw attention to, a really beautiful tree that you sadly can't get to at the moment, but we need to keep an eye on these trees, because I think it's in all of our, it's up to us to protect them and to bestow great tree status as well. So I think that's coming to the end of the trees, but I thought I'd bring up this quote from John Evelyn, who of course his garden is home to one of the great trees, the mulberry tree at Sayes Court. And I thought this was a particularly apt comment to leave you with. So a little bit more about me, as well as the map. I've written these two books, London is a Forest, which is 6 trails around London, and just released this week actually is London Street Trees, and I shall be doing a virtual launch of that in a couple of weeks as well. So London Street Trees, it's the 2nd edition. It's been out for 3 years, but there's a revised edition which is expanded. And you can follow me on thestreettree.com, and I am at the Street Tree on social media. I'm going to share a reminder of the tree map, the Great Trees of London map, which you can get from the Blue Crow Media website this evening. And if you miss out this evening, you can get it tomorrow morning with 10% off. You can click the link which I put in the chat, which I shall do again now. And that link should give you the 10% off when you get to the when you get there automatically. So sorry, that's going to the wrong person. I need to go to everybody. Apologies for sending private messages to people. So click on that, you can get 10% off. If you're struggling to get 10% off, there's a code as well, which I'm going to send to you. So that's the code. The link again is just coming up. And I'll send you the link to my website as well. So if you're interested in following up on anything there. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop that screen share, and I'm going to go back to, I'm going to go to gallery view. So if anybody's got any questions, please start frantically waving and I will unmute you. I can see a lot of people haven't put their video on. So if you want to ask a question, just put your video on and I will get to you. So any questions from anybody, or you want to put it in the chat, and I will, so Paul has a, okay, so first of all, Laura, I'm going to unmute Laura because you got your video and I saw you there. So hopefully you'll be unmuted. You can now ask away, Laura.
Hi, Paul. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, I can.
Great, thank you. That was really, really good. Enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you about the ailanthus with Ada. When do you know when that was planted?
I don't think it was very long ago.
Right.
The ailanthus, tree of heaven, is a species which won't last more than about 70 years. So I suspect that one is maybe only 20 to 30 years old. It grows very, very rapidly as well. So they become very, very big quite quickly. And in fact, they can grow until to become quite large trees. So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, now Paul, I'm going to mute you again, I'm afraid, Laura. Now Paul had a question, and I'm going to find you there, Paul. So I'm going to unmute you. And Paul, what was your question?
Oh, hello. Yes. Do you know about anything about the trees around Coram Fields and Brunswick Square in Bloomsbury near the Family Museum?
Well, I know those trees. I don't know particularly much about them. There are some great trees, particularly in Brunswick Square, which are worth going to see. There's another Baobab.
I just wondered how old you thought they were, or what types they were. Or...
Well, certainly the plane trees in Brunswick Square, not Brunswick Square. What's that square? It is near Brunswick Square. Yeah, they're probably about, Mecklenburg Square. They're about 200 years old. They're probably planted when the squares were built. Coram Fields, there's quite interesting trees around that, including an almond tree, actually.
Yes. Well, so around Georgian times when they built the development, the houses. And,
yes. So I think that, I know that, for instance, was it Jane Austen used to live near there around about 1802. So I imagine they're older than that. So 220 years or more, perhaps.
Right. Amazing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right. Any other questions? I can't see any. If anybody's got a question, frantically wave or put it into the chat, and I will try and get to you. Maybe not. Okay, so sorry, someone else, what's your favorite great tree? That's a very good question, and one that I'm going to have to rack my brains about at the moment. So I think I'm kind of very fond of the Baobab Plain in Ravenscourt Park, I think. I'm also very fond of the Bruce Castle Oak, and I live very close to the Almond Tree in Finsbury Park. Sorry, there's not one tree. I could never leave it at one tree. And I think the other one that I would like to point out as well is the New Cross Gate giant redwood, which I think is wonderful. I've spent quite a lot of time going through New Cross Gate and been noticing that tree for many years and thinking, wow, what a great tree. And it grows quite rapidly as well. So somebody else is asking, are there any online resources you would recommend for those of you that love trees? So there's lots of different online resources, I must say, but I wouldn't know quite where to start. There's a few websites like treetalk.co.uk, Woodland Trust, Trees for Cities, lots of different websites, I think. So thank you everybody for attending. I think if that's the end of the questions, we'll wrap it up. I hope that went fairly smoothly for everybody, and anybody that was a Zoom virgin, it was a quite good experience for you. Apologies for the slight technical glitch when I got lost for a while. So there's one more question from Paul. I'm just going to unmute you, Paul.
I was just curious, with Blue Crow Media, they usually do architecture. How did it come about that the map of trees came into existence?
Well,
did you approach them or did they approach you? And are
no.
there going to be any more in a similar vein, sort of around nature?
Yeah, not that I'm not going to be writing anymore. I don't think. I think it's difficult to do one after London, and I don't know any cities well enough. But I'm sure that Blue Crow Media have plans for other cities, as they have done with architectural maps, like for instance New York, San Francisco. And if anybody is unaware of those maps, they're fascinating maps, including mostly about architecture, modernist, brutalist, Art Deco, constructivist architecture in cities around the world.
Thank you.
Okay. Laura's got another question.
Hello again. Hi. I just was wondering if you know if any or most of the trees that you have on your map are have tree preservation orders on them.
Well, tree preservation orders are administered by local authorities, and one of the sort of interesting things about them is that local authorities never put TPOs on their own trees. So they only ever put TPOs, tree preservation orders, on trees in private land, which I think is a slight problem, because when you think of something like Sheffield, if any of you are aware of what happened in Sheffield, where all the street trees got cut down, that was probably because the council have the control over who manages trees and who cuts trees down and so on. So yeah, I would think that very few of them actually have TPOs on them.
Right. Okay.
Okay, Amy.
Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for your talk. It was brilliant. I just wondered, you mentioned that you do spring walks to see the cherry trees in Herne Hill. Do you do autumn walks?
Yeah, I do walks throughout the year. So obviously not at the moment. But I did do a virtual walk around Hackney last weekend, and I'm probably going to do a virtual walk next weekend as well. Keep an eye on my website at thestreettree.com, where I post information about walks and so on there, and you'd be more than welcome to come along to those. Hopefully we'll be out of lockdown by the autumn, and we'll try and get a binge in. Last year we did West London, Walthamstow, so I tend to do them all over London, so pick different parts of London to do different things. Walthamstow was really good last autumn. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
Pleasure. Right. Any more for any more? Hi. Now.
Hi, Paul.
Anne.
Sorry. I live in Walthamstow. I'd just like to know, what is
Hey.
your favourite tree in Walthamstow?
Oh, well, it's a good question. Where do I start? The Walthamstow horse chestnut is a really good tree. In fact, that's on the map, which is on Wood Street, just near Wood Street Station. And it's a fantastic horse chestnut, which is maybe about 200 years old. It's next to a little clapboard building, which is now a health food store. I don't know whether you know it, but it was
Second Nature. Yes, yes.
Second Nature, that's the place, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's next to that. That used to be a butcher's shop, but now it's a health food shop. So it shows that how Walthamstow's changed over the years.
Right. Sorry, one last question. What's your The giant redwood? Presumably that's still growing. What sort of height will that? They're meant to be like.
Yeah, well, that's a really great question actually, because giant redwoods have been in the UK now for I don't know, maybe 150, 170 years. So they were trees which were growing the west coast, the Pacific Northwest of the United States in California. They were discovered by European colonists in the late 19th century, brought to England, and they were originally known as Wellingtonias, and they still are in this country, named after the Duke of Wellington. But in North America, they call them the giant redwood, and we're beginning to cotton on after 150 years. But in America, they grow to be giant trees, so they are one of the biggest trees in the world. But those trees are hundreds, if not thousands, of years old. The oldest trees in this country are 160, 170 years old, and they're already really big, but they're not anything like as big as those North American trees. Whether they'll eventually get to that size, it's probably unlikely because they're not in a forest situation. So the tall trees are within woodlands surrounded by other tall trees, whereas our trees tend to be on their own.
Thank you.
Pleasure. I'm going to mute you again. I've got a question asking whether I could tell you a bit more about my background and how I got into trees. Well, the obvious answer is, of course, that I'm called Paul Wood, and with a name like that, how could you not be into trees? And I suppose the other answer is I've always been interested in trees. I haven't got a professional background in trees. It's just been an interest and something which I have ever since I wrote a book a few years ago, this book, London Street Trees, available to buy on my website, that I was able to really get into learning a lot more about trees, which I hadn't known as much as I do now, I suppose. And when I started uncovering all these amazing stories about where trees come from all over the world, the amazing diversity of trees that you find in London, and the stories of the old trees, the ancient trees, I found that really fascinating and have been continuing to research that ever since. So I would say that my interest comes from it from a sort of social historical point of view rather than a botanical point of view, although I am sort of rather interested in the nerdy botanical stuff and the Latin names and all that as well. Great. Well, thank you all very much for joining me this evening. I hope you found that interesting. Do go to the Blue Crow website and buy a map. And I hope I will see some of you in real life on a walk or at a talk in the future. And maybe keep an eye on my website and come along to the virtual launch of the London Street Trees revised edition as well. So I think I'm going to wrap that up now. And I'm just going to end the meeting. So thank you again all for coming. And there will be a video of this, I think, as well. So I'm going to post that online, and you should get an email maybe tomorrow or the next day with a link to that once it's up online if you want to follow up then. Okay, thank you all very much. Goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your evening.